Flames swallow Coventry's medieval towers. November 1940. A father clutches his terrified son as bombs scream down. In his coat pocket, sketches of a toy engine the Air Ministry laughed off. Right now, German jets are being built that'll slaughter Allied pilots by the thousands. But this father's desperate promise, whispered through smoke and terror, will flip the entire air war on its head. Here's how a rejected invention saved the skies. Frank Whittle wasn't supposed to invent anything that mattered. Born in Coventry to a mechanic who ran a valve factory, he barely scraped into the RAF. Too short at first, rejected, had to bulk up and reapply. But something in his wiring was different. While other pilots saw planes as machines to master, Whittle saw them as problems begging to be broken open and rebuilt. In 1928, at 21, he's flying aerobatics over Cranwell, and his mind won't shut up about one nagging question. Why are we still strapping propellers to the front of these things like it's 1903? The other pilots thought he was brilliant but odd, the kind of guy who'd sketch engine designs during briefings, who'd argue with instructors about thermodynamics instead of just nodding along. His commanding officers noticed, not always in a good way. Whittle had that dangerous combination of working-class hunger and intellectual arrogance. He didn't just want to fly, he wanted to reimagine what flying meant. And that question about propellers kept gnawing at him, especially during high-altitude flights where the air thinned and piston engines gasped for oxygen like drowning men. He started reading everything he could find on gas turbines, which at the time were crude industrial machines used in power plants, not exactly the stuff of aviation dreams. But Whittle saw something nobody else did. If you could miniaturize the concept, contain the combustion, and direct the thrust backward, you could eliminate the propeller entirely. No more drag, no more torque, no more altitude limitations, just pure, screaming forward momentum. The math worked, the physics checked out. All he needed was someone to listen. But that question, the one that seemed so obvious to him, was about to get him laughed out of every room that mattered. January 1930, Whittle writes his thesis, Future Developments in Aircraft Design. He lays out jet propulsion, air sucked in, compressed, ignited, blasted out the back. Pure thrust, no propeller drag. The RAF officers read it, smile politely, and file it under Interesting Theory, Zero Practical Value. One review literally called it impracticable. Not wrong, just impracticable. Like, yeah, sure, kid, maybe in a science fiction novel. The Air Ministry Patent Office, they let his patent application lapse in 1935 because he couldn't afford the $5 renewal fee. £5. That's what stood between Britain and air superiority. Think about that for a second. The entire trajectory of aerial warfare, the technology that would define the second half of the 20th century, the reason you can fly to Spain for a weekend, all of it almost died because a junior officer couldn't scrape together £5. Whittle wasn't asking for £1 million research budget. He just needed the idea protected while he figured out how to build the damn thing. But the bureaucrats saw a poor kid with a wild idea and decided their filing fee was more important than his future. Meanwhile, he's scraping by on an RAF officer's pittance, teaching at Cranwell, watching his idea collect dust. His colleagues still respected him. He was a hell of a pilot after all, but they thought he'd wasted his thesis on fantasy. Even the ones who understood the science figured it was decades away from practical application. Whittle would sit in the officers' mess listening to talk about incremental improvements to piston engines, about shaving a few mph off drag coefficients, and he'd want to scream because he knew there was a ceiling to piston technology and the RAF was already bumping its head against it. But across the channel, someone else wasn't laughing. Here's what nobody told Whittle. The Germans were building their own jet. Hans von Ohain, backed by Heinkel, had resources Whittle could only hallucinate about. While Whittle begged for pennies, von Ohain had workshops, funding, institutional support. A whole team of engineers who treated jet propulsion like a legitimate engineering challenge, not a parlor trick. Von Ohain wasn't smarter than Whittle. If anything, Whittle's design was more elegant, but he had something Whittle didn't, a country that took him seriously. By 1937, von Ohain's prototype was running. By 1939, the Hui 178 would fly, the first jet aircraft in history. Whittle didn't know this yet, but the clock wasn't just ticking, it was screaming. And the reason this matters, the reason his rejection wasn't just bureaucratic laziness, is that Britain was about to face an enemy that could outfly, outgun, and outlast anything in the RAF's arsenal. The Battle of Britain would be won by Spitfires and Hurricanes, sure, but barely. Narrow margins. Pilot exhaustion. If the Luftwaffe had deployed jets in 1940 instead of 1944, the outcome might have been very different. And the man who could have stopped it was being ignored in a corner garage, held together by hope and the charity of strangers. So how does a broke, ignored pilot with a lapsed patent end up building the engine anyway? That's where things get desperate. Whittle's patent is dead. The Air Ministry won't touch him. He's teaching cadets, swallowing his frustration, and his engine is nothing but paper. Then, two former RAF buddies, Rolf Dudley Williams and James Tainling, knock on his door. They've got an idea. Find private money, build it ourselves, prove the bastards wrong. Whittle's sceptical at first. He's been burned by institutional rejection so many times that belief feels dangerous. But Dudley Williams and Tainling aren't dreamers. They're pragmatists with connections. They scrape together investors, a retired banker who'd made money in textiles and had a soft spot for underdogs, a couple of businessmen who didn't understand the science but understood betting on people. And here's the heartbreaker. A corner shop widow named Lena Williams ponies up cash because she believes in this skinny, obsessive pilot. She'd lost her husband in the Great War, knew what it meant to fight for something bigger than yourself, and saw that same desperation in Whittle's eyes. They form Powerjets Lantide in March 1936. It's not glamorous. It's a rented garage in Rugby, scavenged parts, second-hand lathes. The company is basically Whittle, a couple of engineers willing to work for promises, and a dream held together with wire and wishful thinking. They can't afford proper metallurgy testing. They can't afford wind tunnel time. Hell, they can barely afford the electricity to keep the lights on. But they've got something the Air Ministry doesn't. Urgency born from being told no so many times that yes becomes a moral imperative. Whittle throws himself into the work with an intensity that scares his team. 18-hour days, skipping meals, chain smoking to stay alert. His wife Dorothy barely sees him, and when she does, he's a ghost, physically present but mentally 3 moves ahead on some engineering problem she's legally forbidden from hearing about. Because that's the other knife twist. Even though the Air Ministry won't fund him, they've classified his work under the Official Secrets Act, so he can't crowdsource solutions, can't publish papers, can't even vent to his spouse about why he's unraveling. But Whittle's about to learn that belief and resources are two very different things. The first test in April 1937 nearly kills them all. The engine, basically a metal donut wrapped in hope, spins up, hits 8,000 RPM, and then the turbine blades start glowing. Not warm. Glowing. White hot. The workshop floods with heat, and Whittle's team freezes, waiting for the whole thing to grenade. You can see it on the test footage they shot. Grainy, black and white, but the terror's in high definition. Whittle's standing there, hand hovering near the fuel cutoff, calculating the exact second between catastrophic failure and we lose 6 months of work. It doesn't explode, but it doesn't work either. The blades are warping from heat stress. The fuel mixture's burning too rich. The compression ratio's off. They shut it down, stare at the wreckage, and realise they've got no idea how to cool the damn thing. This isn't a problem you solve with elbow grease. It's materials science, and they don't have access to the alloys that might work. So they improvise, they try different blade geometries, they adjust fuel flow rates, they test, fail, rebuild, test again. Months crawl by. Whittle's health cracks, stomach ulcers, sleepless nights, chain smoking to stay functional. His team notices he's losing weight, that his hands shake when he's not holding a wrench or a cigarette. Dudley Williams pulls him aside one night, tells him he needs to slow down or he'll kill himself before the engine works. Whittle just laughs, this hollow, exhausted sound, and says the engine's the only thing keeping him alive. Because if he stops, if he admits defeat, then all those rejections were right. Then his son grows up in a world where the bad guys have better planes. His wife Dorothy knows something's eating him alive, but he can't tell her. Official Secrets Act. He's legally forbidden from sharing the weight. So she watches her husband disappear into a project she doesn't understand, helpless to do anything but keep the home running and pray he comes back to her in one piece. It's a special kind of cruelty, being married to someone who's drowning and not being allowed to know why. And while he's bleeding himself dry in that garage, the Luftwaffe is gearing up to turn Britain into rubble. This is the part that wrecks me. Whittle isn't failing because he's wrong. He's failing because he's alone. Every engineering puzzle, cooling, fuel flow, combustion stability, he's solving with duct tape and desperation. Compare that to Germany. Von Ohein's got Heinkel's full factory, metallurgists, chemists, wind tunnels. Whittle's got a widow's savings and 2 loyal friends. But here's the thing about obsession. It doesn't care about fairness. By late 1938, they've cracked some of the cooling problems. Not elegantly, they're basically brute-forcing solutions through trial and error, but it's progress. The engine runs for longer stretches without melting. The thrust measurements start hitting numbers that matter. And slowly, grudgingly, the Air Ministry starts paying attention. Not because they suddenly believe in Whittle, they're terrified of Germany. Intelligence reports are screaming about Luftwaffe expansion, about new aircraft designs, about a war everyone knows is coming. In 1939, with Europe sliding toward catastrophe, the ministry finally contracts Whittle to build a flight-capable engine. They partner with Gloucester Aircraft to design an airframe around his jet, the E-2839. First flight scheduled for 1941. It's vindication, sort of, but it's also 2 years too late to beat the Germans. And Whittle knows it. He's winning the argument but losing the race, and the gap between those two things is measured in lives. The team expands. Real engineers now, not just true believers. They move to better facilities. The engine design matures. By 1940, they've got something that looks less like a science experiment and more like a weapon. But the work is still brutal, still secretive, still extracting everything Whittle has to give and asking for more. But before that happens, Whittle's world is about to burn. November 14th, 1940, Coventry. Whittle's home. The Luftwaffe sends 515 bombers, Operation Moonlight Sonata. They level the city. Medieval cathedral, gone. Factories, ash. Homes, craters. The bombers come in waves starting at dusk, and the raid doesn't stop until dawn. 12 hours of sustained bombing that kills 568 people and leaves thousands homeless. The city Whittle grew up in, where his father ran that valve shop, where he learned to love machines. Obliterated. Whittle's there with his son, Ian, watching the sky burn. The noise is inhuman. Engines, sirens, explosions overlapping into a sustained roar that vibrates your ribcage. Ian's clinging to his father, eyes wide, and Whittle's holding him so tight his arms ache. They're in the garden. Nowhere else to go because the public shelters are packed and their house doesn't have a basement. So they crouch there, father and son, while the world ends overhead. In his coat pocket, sketches of the engine, the one that might have intercepted these bombers if anyone had listened 5 years ago, if the patent hadn't lapsed. If the ministry had funded him in 1930 instead of dismissing him as impracticable. Whittle does the math in his head, can't help himself, it's how he's wired. If British jets had been operational, if they'd had the altitude and speed advantage, how many of those 515 bombers would have made it through? How many of those 568 dead could have been saved? The sketches in his pocket feel like they're burning through the fabric. And in that moment, something inside him breaks and hardens at the same time. He whispers to Ian. Witnesses later recall him murmuring through the smoke, something about ending this and never again. We don't know the exact words. Whittle never talked about it publicly, and Ian was too young to remember the specifics. But we know what happened next. The morning after, Coventry's a smoking graveyard. Whittle walks through streets he grew up on, now unrecognizable. He sees the cathedral's skeleton, those Gothic arches standing like a ribcage against the grey sky. He sees families digging through rubble with bare hands, looking for relatives or possessions or any scrap of their former lives. He sees a woman holding a child's shoe, just standing there in the middle of the destroyed street, holding this tiny shoe and sobbing. And something in Whittle's chest locks into place. The engine isn't a career move anymore. It's not about proving the ministry wrong or securing his legacy. It's a debt. A moral obligation to the people who died because the right technology came too late. He returns to the garage with a fury his team's never seen. No more cautious tests, no more waiting for ministry approvals, no more incremental improvements. They're going to make this thing fly. Bureaucracy be damned. The team picks up on his energy, part inspiration, part fear, because they've never seen Whittle like this. He's always been intense, but now there's something desperate in his eyes, like he's racing against a clock only he can hear, and 4 months later, they do. April 12th, 1941. The engine roars to life, Not sputtering, not dying, but roaring. A sustained, howling thrust that rattles the test stand and shakes dust from the rafters. Whittle's team stands there, stunned, as the thing they've bled for finally works. Not sort of works, not works with caveats, just works. The thrust measurements are solid, the combustion's stable, the turbine isn't melting. For the first time since 1930, Whittle allows himself to believe this might actually happen. They run the engine for hours, pushing it through different throttle settings, listening for the warning signs of failure. Nothing. It just keeps screaming, converting fuel into thrust with an efficiency that makes piston engines look like steam locomotives. The sound is incredible. Not the coughing chug of a propeller engine, but a smooth, continuous roar that feels like the future announcing itself. May 15th, 1941, Gloucester E-2839 takes off from Cranwell, Jerry Sayer at the controls. The jet climbs smooth, no propeller vibration, no torque twist, just pure forward scream. It's a short flight, 17 minutes, but every second rewrites the rulebook. Sayer later describes it as the smoothest aircraft he's ever flown, like the plane's being pulled through the air instead of fighting it. Ground crew watches in silence, then erupts. Mechanics who've spent years on piston engines just stand there with their mouths open, watching this impossible thing carve through the sky. Whittle doesn't celebrate. He just stands there, shaking, knowing they're still years behind the Germans. The May 262 is coming. Intelligence reports are already whispering about a German jet fighter in development, and Whittle does the brutal calculus. If he'd been funded in 1930 instead of 1936, if that patent hadn't lapsed, if the ministry had taken him seriously, how many pilots would have lived? How many cities would have been spared? That question haunted him for the rest of his life. So did his engine actually change the war, or did it just arrive too late to matter? Because here's where the story gets complicated, where triumph and tragedy blur into something harder to categorize. The short answer: both. The Gloucester E-2839 proves jet propulsion works. It's a technological moonshot, the kind of breakthrough that redefines possibility. But operationally, it's a prototype, a proof of concept, not a war winner. The Air Ministry finally wakes up all the way, contracts for production versions, designates the Gloucester Meteor as Britain's first operational jet fighter. But development takes time. Resources are stretched thin across a dozen fronts. The Meteor doesn't enter service until July 1944, 3 years after that first flight. And by then, the air war's already tilted in the Allies' favour. By 1944, Whittle's design powers the Gloucester Meteor, Britain's first operational jet fighter. They're fast, climbing to 40,000 feet, chasing V-1 flying bombs over London. Pilots love them. The Meteor's responsive, powerful, stable at speeds that would have torn a Spitfire apart. It's everything Whittle promised and more. But here's the gut punch. The Meteor mostly fights robots, not German jets, because by the time it's combat ready, the Luftwaffe's already crippled. The Strategic Air Campaign has decimated German fuel production. Their pilot training pipelines shattered. The experienced aces are dead or grounded. So Britain's got this incredible machine, this glimpse of the future, and they're using it to swat V-1 Buzz bombs, glorified cruise missiles that fly in straight lines. It's effective work, sure. The Meteors saved London from hundreds of V-1s, but it's not the dogfighting supremacy Whittle envisioned. Meanwhile, the Me-262, Hitler's wonder weapon, is tearing through B-17 formations, killing American boys who've got no defense against 540 Portale-amper cannon fire. Allied bomber crews call them blow jobs because you'd see the jet, then blow, your wingman's gone. Just disintegrated in a hail of 30mm rounds before anyone could react. The Me-262's not just faster, it's faster in a way that breaks the OODA loop. Observe, orient, decide, act. By the time a B-17 gunner observes the jet, orients his turret, decides to shoot, and acts, the Me-262's already 2 miles away setting up another pass. And every time Whittle hears about another downed crew, he does the math in his head. The Me-262 enters service in July 1944. It's faster, deadlier, and operationally superior to anything the Allies field. If Germany had deployed it earlier, if Hitler hadn't insisted on turning it into a bomber first, if the Luftwaffe had prioritized fighter production over vanity projects, air superiority might have swung. But they didn't. Delays, infighting, resources stretched thin across a collapsing empire. The Nazis built about 1,400 Me-262s, but only flew maybe 200 in combat because they couldn't fuel them, couldn't train pilots fast enough, couldn't protect the airfields from Allied bombing. The Allies win the air war not because of better jets, but because of overwhelming numbers and German logistical collapse. Whittle's Meteor? It shoots down 14 V-1s. Respectable, but not war-changing. The real dogfighting happens with piston fighters, Mustangs, Thunderbolts, Spitfires, grinding down the Luftwaffe through attrition and superior tactics. But here's what matters. The real impact comes after the war. Whittle's centrifugal flow design seeds every jet engine for the next decade. American, Soviet, commercial. The de Havilland Comet, Boeing 707, MiG-15, all children of that garage in Rugby. The Soviets literally copy his design after British engineers give them a demonstration in 1946. America buys the rights and builds the General Electric J-33, which powers the F-80 Shooting Star and the Lockheed T-33. Within 10 years of that first flight, jet propulsion goes from impracticable fantasy to global standard. Airlines ditch propellers, air forces retire their piston fighters. The sound of the sky changes. But, for Whittle, the victory tastes like ash. Here's what eats at him. Every month the Air Ministry delayed, every funding fight, every bureaucrat who called it a toy. That wasn't just red tape. That was lives. Historians estimate the Me-262 downed 500-plus Allied aircraft. Extrapolate the delays in British jet deployment. Factor in what earlier air superiority might have meant for bombing campaigns, D-Day prep, the whole war trajectory, and you're looking at thousands of lives hanging on decisions made in stuffy ministry offices in 1930. Think about the bomber crews who died in 1943, 1944, flying missions that might have been safer with jet escort. Think about the cities bombed because the RAF couldn't intercept fast enough. Think about the cascading consequences of technology arriving 5 years late. Whittle thought about it constantly. He'd lie awake doing the calculus, sketching alternate timelines in his head where the patent doesn't lapse, where the ministry listens, where the jets arrive in time. It's a special kind of torture, succeeding wildly while knowing your success came too late to save the people who mattered most. Whittle gets knighted in 1948, receives accolades, the press calls him a visionary, but he's already unravelling. Ulcers. Depression, a sense that he built the future but couldn't save the present. His health never really recovers from those garage years. The chain smoking becomes a permanent fixture. The stress ulcers flare up whenever he thinks too hard about the war. And he thinks about the war constantly. And the cost of that realization breaks him in ways no medal can fix. So what happens to a man who changes the world but can't escape the ghosts of what might have been? Because the post-war years should have been Whittle's victory lap. Recognition, wealth, the satisfaction of being proven right. But trauma doesn't care about vindication. PTSD doesn't clock out because you won. And Whittle's carrying weight that most people can't even see. Post-war, Whittle's a national hero. Knighted, celebrated, invited to every aviation gala. The RAF promotes him. Engineers study his designs, textbooks include his name alongside the Wright brothers, but behind closed doors he's disintegrating. The ulcers worsen, perforated stomach lining, constant pain, a diet restricted to bland foods and antacids. His marriage to Dorothy crumbles. How do you stay married to a man legally gagged from sharing his demons? How do you love someone who's physically present but emotionally locked in a garage in 1937, replaying every failure? They try. God knows they try. But the war created a gulf between them that neither can bridge. Dorothy stuck by him through the poverty years, the obsession years, the years when he disappeared into the work and came home a ghost. But peace doesn't fix that. If anything, it makes it worse, because now there's no urgent project to channel his anxiety into. Just the echoes of what might have been. They divorce in 1976 after 46 years of marriage. The split's quiet, dignified, sad in the way that long, slow endings are sad. No dramatic blow-up, just two people acknowledging they've been strangers for decades. Whittle remarries later, Hazel Hall, an American, and moves to the United States, works as a consultant for various aerospace firms. The change of scenery helps, sort of. America doesn't carry the same wartime ghosts. He can talk about jet engines without mentally subtracting lives lost. But the weight doesn't lift. In interviews through the 70s and 80s, he's gracious, humble, but there's a sadness in his eyes that footage can't hide. He'll talk about the engineering challenges, about the thrill of that first flight, but when interviewers ask about the war, about the delays, about what might have been, you can see him retreat. Not evasion exactly, more like touching a wound that never quite healed. Because Britain didn't just delay his engine, they extracted everything he had and gave him a title in return. In '96, President Reagan awards him the Charles Stark Draper Prize, America honoring the Brit who invented the jet age. Whittle's 79, frail, still chain-smoking despite the lung damage. He gives a quiet speech about teamwork, persistence, the usual. Thanks his old Power Jets crew, most of whom are dead by now. Thanks the RAF for eventually believing in him. Thanks his family for tolerating his absence. It's gracious and understated, the kind of speech that doesn't mention ulcers or divorce or the nights he woke up calculating casualty rates. But in private conversations, he returns again and again to the same question. What if they'd listened in 1930? Not bitterness, exactly. More like a man replaying a chess game, spotting the fork he missed 50 years ago. He tells friends about the lapsed patent, about Lena Williams' corner shop money, about testing engines in a garage while Von O'Hine had a factory. Not complaining, Whittle didn't complain, but trying to understand how the system failed so spectacularly. His health fails through the 90s. Lung cancer, complications from decades of chain smoking. His body finally gives out on August 8, 1996, age 89. He dies in Maryland, surrounded by his second family, mourned by an aerospace industry that owes him everything. His ashes are flown back to Britain, scattered at RAF Cranwell, the place where it all started, where a 21-year-old pilot first asked why we're still using propellers. And in the end, the skies he saved became his only resting place. Whittle's tragedy isn't that he failed, it's that he succeeded despite a system designed to crush him, and the victory still felt like defeat. He gave Britain and the world the future of flight. In return, he got poverty, isolation, broken health, and the haunting arithmetic of delayed salvation. Every jet you've ever flown on, every sonic boom, every contrail scratched across the sky, that's Whittle's legacy. Think about that next time you're cruising at 35,000 feet, sipping a drink, watching movies on a transatlantic flight. The reason you can do that, the reason commercial aviation exists in its current form, is because a broke mechanic's son from Coventry refused to accept impracticable as an answer. The Boeing 787 you're sitting in, the Airbus A350, every civilian and military jet on Earth, they're all grandchildren of that first screaming prototype in rugby. But it's also a reminder that genius without institutional support is just suffering in slow motion. Whittle wasn't lacking in vision or skill or work ethic. He was lacking the £5 for a patent renewal. He was lacking a bureaucracy willing to bet on radical ideas. He was lacking a support system that valued breakthrough over incremental improvement. And that gap between potential and institutional willingness cost lives. The Air Ministry didn't kill those bomber crews, but their delays sure as hell didn't save them. Every month they spent deliberating was a month Germany spent building jets. Every funding meeting Whittle had to grovel through was time Von O'Hine spent in the workshop. And the people who paid the price weren't the bureaucrats who said no, they got pensions and quiet retirements. The people who paid were 19-year-old tail gunners who died in flames over Germany because their escorts couldn't keep up. Whittle knew this, lived with it every day, and that knowledge hollowed him out in ways the ulcers and chain smoking only accelerated. Because how do you reconcile being right, provably historically right, with being too late to matter when it counted most? How do you accept accolades for changing the world while mentally tallying the lives your delayed breakthrough couldn't save? You don't, really. You just carry it. And that's what Whittle did for 50 years, carried the weight